Hello and welcome everyone. Welcome to day 2 of the Social Outcomes Conference. Thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive session on children's services in Europe, where we're exploring the use of social impact bonds to commission more preventative services. My name's Eleanor Carter. I'm Research Director for the Government Outcomes Lab team, and we have a great and very packed session for you today. The session will explore the use of different outcomes contracts, sometimes known as social impact bonds, that focus on children's services in different contexts across Europe. We're hoping to take a comparative lens, draw out some of the different justifications that have been used for these projects, the different development experiences, design choices, and for some of the more mature projects, reflect on some of their results and findings. The session will build on 2 research pieces from the GoLab team and RISE, the Research Institute of Sweden, and we'll combine this with more practitioner insights and reflections from the ground, from the Positive Families Partnership, which is a project based in London in the UK, and the city of Tampere in Finland. I'm really thrilled to introduce our speakers for the session. We have Thomas Bockström, Louisa Vildo and Jacob Wissen joining us from RISE in Sweden. We have Esko-Pekka joining us from Tampere in Finland. Tanya Hamid is with us in person in Oxford, and Mila Lukic is here in Oxford too from Bridges Fund Management. We also have Jonathan Gill joining us online, and Raphael, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. You'll notice I'm not wearing a bow tie. My apologies, we've had a last minute change of chair. Unfortunately, Michael Sanders was taken unwell yesterday, so we've sent him our best wishes, but I'll be standing in and chairing the session today. So just a note, this is our first hybrid conference. So we have a few people in the room in Oxford, but most of our participants are online around the world. Welcome, everyone. We're going to be using the chat function a lot in this session. So please do introduce yourselves, say hello and where you're from in the chat. If you would, it would be lovely to hear from you. And just a note on the format for the session. We have 4 presentations. So each team will have 10 minutes to present to us, offering their insights and reflections from their project. Please do feel able to write questions for each of the teams in the chat. What I propose we do is that we take any short clarifying questions immediately after each of the presentations, but that we hold the bigger, more provocative, deeper questions for a discussion section towards the end of the session. So we're hoping to bring in lots of reflections from the audience. I know that I've seen a lot of familiar faces and really keen to draw in on these practice reflections from our audience today. So we'll move into a discussion portion later on in the session. I should also flag that there are members of the GoLab team here to help you if you have any questions. Andrea is here in the room to help any concerns that you have there. And Ruth has kindly offered to help with any questions that you might have online. So do feel able to reach out to the GoLab team if you have any questions or challenges. But now I'd like to pass to the first presentation. So we've ordered the sequence of presentations in the order, almost like an arc of development for these different projects, moving from the sort of the youngest and most emergent project to the most completed. And so it's my pleasure to pass over to the team from RISE. Over to you guys. You have 10 minutes to present.
Thank you so much, Eleanor, and hi everyone. Really happy to see you and looking forward to this conversation. I hope you can hear me well. So I'm Thomas, and together with Louisa and Jacob, we will give you some insights from our work, and hopefully it will be up for discussion then afterwards, because of course we only have 10 minutes for this. So social outcomes contracting as an implementation strategy. we as Social and Health Impact Center at RISE, we are focused on welfare innovation. So RISE is an innovation partner, a state-owned research institute for all of society, industry, and public sector. But we are only focused on the welfare services and innovation in that sense. So we try to find new solutions to shift the system towards more proactive and preventative solutions. And we are exploring social outcomes contract as one of those potential tools to achieve this. Next, please. So our agenda here is to say something about our reflections on social outcomes contracting as an implementation strategy. And you get a bit of history from our development, of course, very short. And then we go into a specific case, Lovisa, and Jacob will say something about what are we looking forward to in our upcoming work. So we started in Sweden. This work started with very bottom down, where we have a lot of local authorities exploring social investment and putting aside their own funding for doing different kinds of social investment innovations. But we soon realized that there was a limited local government capacity to drive this kind of work, and we needed to find new tools to actually achieve outcomes focus in services, because as you may recognize from your own contexts, we are quite stuck in an activity focus and thinking more about how much resources we spend rather than the outcomes that we want to achieve. And this is, at least from my experience, a very rigid kind of culture that we have for maybe for good reasons, but still that we are struggling a bit with in our everyday work at service level, but also at the more strategic level. And of course, we also have these challenges in finding cross-sectorial models that actually help different stakeholders to drive outcomes. So we experimented with the social outcomes contracting model, and it was very important in our first days, in our first case, to have a really stringent business case. So it was quite focused on the financial savings, and actually we needed to define a case where we had cashable savings for the local authority. So we looked at children in institutional care and designed a social outcomes contract in order to improve service quality and to reduce the risk of reoccurring placements in institutional care. So this was rather more of an early intervention setup, maybe not so preventative and not so early in the process, if you say so, but still quite important to as a first step for us. And if we take the next slide. And what we learned after this first case, and also from our second, which was on occupational health actually, so not on social services, but anyway, we still find that these economic or financial incentives, they seem to be quite limited as an implementation driver, which may or may not be surprising for you, but well, from the financial, from the strategic leads, from the local authority level, and from the CFOs and so on, they were quite emphasizing the financial aspects of these models. So you could expect that this would be an important factor, but we found out that financial risk sharing and financial incentives are not enough to drive implementation. So we are now trying to redefine this as a more holistic implementation strategy, where we need to look more into how we facilitate organizational change in public sector and how they collaborate with other agencies. And we need to increase understanding of the dependencies between different stakeholders. Next, please. So I think I run out of time here almost, but anyway, so we looked at the social outcomes contracting model as a kind of vehicle to drive change at the political level, at the organizational level, how we do public procurement, and many different aspects of this. And we also think that we need to work with all levels of prevention. So that's what the triangle here to the right tries to show. And now Lovisa and Jacob will lead us down in this triangle. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Thomas. So next slide, please. One example of how we do this is actually our current project together with Hässelby Vällingby, which is a small district administration here in Stockholm, Sweden. And they found that despite their efforts, they had for a long time experienced a large increase in reports when it comes to children with criminal behavior. And oftentimes it was the same individuals that kept reoccurring in their systems. And it wasn't until they showed a very high risk of becoming criminals, or when they actually already had started the criminal path, that they qualified for an intervention. And at the same time, the social services noticed that the families had a low trust in the local authorities. So when they actually were offered these interventions, they usually declined. So they found that they needed a new form of intervention, and they needed new ways of reaching these families. And so together with us at RISE, they started a social outcomes contract with 5 civil society actors. And the project has now been active for only a couple of weeks. But this is mainly how it works. Next slide. At the really rough level. There is a council that consists of representatives from all the different civil society actors. And at this council, the social services comes and presents the children's story. So how his or her family situation is, whether or not the individual show any norm-breaking behavior, and so on. And then the council discusses and actually reach an agreement on which kind of interventions to offer to this specific individual. And the interventions, they target 4 different areas. So we have school, leisure, and we also have family situation and psychological health. And this project is measured on both process goals and outcomes goals. And the process goals are based on quick results, and it's actually paid out to the organization that is responsible for that specific intervention. Whereas the outcome goals are actually assessed collectively. So in order for one organization to get paid, everyone else needs to succeed. And so far, at least, this has actually created a great foundation for cooperation within this council. But what we have noticed so far is that an individual is very rarely there for only one problem. Oftentimes, we offer interventions targeting different areas of that person's life. And we have seen that some of these risk factors actually stem from the same common components. So we started thinking, can we go either further down this prevention triangle that Thomas showed? So with that said, Jacob.
Yes, thank you, Louisa. So what's next? So we want to, as Louisa was saying, we want to build this long-term capacity to work with prevention and proactivity. We want to move further down in this pyramid of indicated, selective, and universal prevention. What we have found out is that SOC models works best for a defined target group or a defined issue. What we are exploring currently is to address multiple needs with various interventions. That is, when you do interventions towards already defined issue, it's sometimes, or it's per definition, reactive. And we want to elaborate with this, how to work both proactively and preventative. So we want to move from single interventions to long-term prevention and proactivity. So if you illustrate this as this pyramid directed towards an outcome, that is like crime, for instance, how do we address this? We can address this with indicated, selective, and universal interventions. But as Louisa was saying, we also see that those risk factors and indeed protective factors, those different issues in the star share the common components of risk factors. And parallel to building this evidence base that can be used in communicating these common risk factors, we want to find a way to also address those common risk factors together with different actors. So we have a hypothesis of place-based interventions that we're currently exploring. And how we do this is just one example of how we do this. But this is called a collective impact model in a southern region of Stockholm, where we build or initiate a collaborating model that consists of these local actors in the middle, this yellow dimension. It can be civil society actors. It can also be public actors and private actors. What we find key here is that we do have this inhabitants or citizens council that plays a very important part in both defining the issues and the problems, the different problems, and also make decisions on how to properly respond to them. What we also see as key in this model, and that we constantly learn, is this backbone organization in the gray area, which we currently stand for at RISE. But we find this backbone organization as really, really important to both facilitate and sustain this kind of collaborative model. And then you can also work with measuring and evaluating the system that is kind of dependent from us. So that's just one example of this place-based intervention model that we're currently exploring, with the ambition to, find different models that, to different local contexts that tie everyone to the mast. If you want to go back to the title of this presentation. That's it for now. We look forward to your comments and questions, further presentations. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that fascinating presentation. We haven't had any clarifying questions come in, but there are certainly some themes that I think people will want to pick up on. Curious about this cooperative structure that you're beginning to talk about, and where collective impact might meet a social outcomes contract, and this backbone structure that you're talking about. It'd be really interesting to pick up more on those themes in our discussion section. But now I'd like to pass.
One question.
Oh, sorry.
Michael Robinson.
Oh, okay, sorry. I'm advised that there is a question in the chat. Michael Robinson, would you like to come off mute and ask your question?
Hiya. Just a couple of points I put in the chat box. It's because of the interventions, the nature of them. Are they jointly identified with the family and young people? Are they almost prescribed to the young person or family? And linked to that, whatever the interventions may be, obviously in the UK we've got the Early Intervention Foundation as a suite of evidence-based or evidence-informed programmes. So it's the nature of any programmes that are delivered to the children and young people in the form of interventions.
Thank you, Michael. Would someone on the RISE team like to respond to this choice of different intervention options question?
I'm actually going to pass it down to Lovisa because she's involved with this project.
I actually couldn't hear the question. I don't know if it's my internet connection that is bad or
in the chat.
You can read it in the chat as well. But maybe to save time, you can say that this is partly co-created with the families and children, because they are offered these services, and the third sector organizations involved in this, they have to innovate on an individual level. How can we combine our offerings or our services in order to actually meet the demands or the identified situations? So it's, but they are also using some evidence-based like family support interventions and so on. So it's a bit of a mix, I would guess. And we can come back to this also when we know more about how it's actually evolving. As Lovisa said, it's so new. It's have just started with the first few individuals so far. So.
Thank you, Thomas. I think it's a really interesting challenge of how to bring and braid together different interventions under this collective impact framework. So a really interesting theme. I'd now like to pass over to Esko-Pekka Järvinen from Tampere in Finland. We would love to hear your presentation, Esko-Pekka. Thank you for joining us.
Okay, good day everyone. I hope you can hear me loud and clear. My name is Esko-Pekka Järvinen. I'm a project manager working in the city of Tampere at the Tampere Junior Development Program. And my presentation is about Social Impact Bond Tampere project and future for young people aged 15 to 17 who are in alternative care. Next slide, please. Just a few words about my hometown. It's the third largest city in Finland with 240,000 residents, and it's the largest inland city in the Nordic countries measured by population. And it's also an attractive city and a popular city to study and live in. So next, please. Okay. Here are the starting points for the SIB project in Tampere. According to a survey made by Finnish Institute for Health and Welfare, in Finland, approximately half of the age group growing up to adulthood in foster care end up without completing a post-primary education. The phenomenon is similar in other Nordic countries. However, in Finland, young people who have been in alternative care seem to have a weaker attachment to employment. Hence, it would be important to support the education of children placed outside the home. But in Finland, at the moment, there seem to be very few special support measures aimed at solving this problem. Next slide, please. So on the left, you can see how the placement outside the home is connected to interrupted school paths. And on the right side, you can see how placement outside the home is connected, being outside of education and employment. Next slide, please. The city of Tampere has obtained impact investments to promote the education and employment of young people aged 15 to 17. And the implementation period of the project is 10 years. And there's also longitudinal research on the project, and it is conducted by the Finnish Institute for Health and Welfare. The project investor is FIM Private Equity Funds Ltd with 4 main investors. And this project is managed by the Tampere Junior Development Program. Next slide, please. Okay, so a few words about the target group of the project. The target group of the project is young people aged 15 to 17 who were born in 2003 to 2005, living in Tampere, who were placed in child welfare institutions or families at the end of 2020. The target group includes 185 young persons. 111 young persons were placed in child welfare institutions and 74 were in families. In Tampere, approximately 2.3% of the young people aged 15 to 17 have been taken into care. And at the moment, we are contacting the young people of this target group with the help of social workers. Next slide, please. Here are the objectives of the Young People SIB Tampere project. Our first goal is that 80% of the target group have completed a secondary education by the year they turn 25. And the second goal is that 80% are employed or studying in a higher education institution during the year they turn 25. Next slide, please. Okay, and the services produced in the project do not replace any statutory services that the municipality is obliged to organize for a young person. And the participation in the project is, of course, voluntary for a young person. The young people will be entitled to the services of the project until the end of the calendar year during which they turn 25. And it is also possible to sign up for this project as late as the age of 24. And a young person who signs up can receive the services regularly or occasionally. And next slide, please. Okay, so here's something about the segmentation of the project. Young people growing up in alternative care form a heterogeneous group. In the SIB project, young people have been divided into 4 segments based on certain criteria. Based on the objectives, the project has defined key variables to be used as a basis for segmentation. Average grade of the latest comprehensive school certificate, is it below 7 or 7 or above? And just a reminder, in Finland, the grading scale is from 4 to 10. And other variables include the possibility of mental health problem, criminal background, and also substance abuse. In segment number 1, in which the young people have the most difficult situations, they are placed in an institution, they have low school grades, mental health problems, criminal backgrounds, and also substance abuse issues. The complete opposite, in segment number 4, young people are placed in families and do not have any of those problems I mentioned. Next slide, please. Okay, and the impact and tracking of the SIB project. The public sector only pays for results that are in line with the set targets. The payment of the outcome bonus is based on the education and employment of the participants. Payment is also linked to the segment group, meaning that the payment bonus is bigger with the heavier segment groups. Participants' use of social, health, and employment services are also monitored by the city of Tampere, and information about their well-being is collected by service providers. In addition, the Finnish Institute for Health and Welfare implements a study to assess the benefits and potential disadvantages and the impact of the activities on young people and the cost effectiveness. Next slide, please. Young people need someone to walk beside them. In the project preparation, 5 key activities have been identified for the target group. These are everyday management, study and working skills, and how to support a young person in his or her operational environment, also motivation and faith in the future, and of course, the support of the families. Next slide, please. And here's a quote from a young person who is participating in the SIB project here in Tampere. I think your work has been okay all the time. We have always managed to get things done somehow, or I've received help if I've needed it. And I think this sounds pretty nice at the moment, since this is our first year with young people participating in this project. So it looks good at the moment, I think. So next slide, please. And it's there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Esko-Pekka. Really lovely to finish with that quote. Thank you. I wonder actually if I could offer a clarifying question to you. Actually, drawing on Michael's question again, you talked about walking beside young people, and it would be helpful to know, I think, how standardized or fixed the service intervention is for young people on this program. Do they have choice to design the shape of the service themselves?
Yes, there are third sector organizations which we are using and they can arrange it how the young people want it to be made. I don't know. Yeah.
That's helpful.
Yeah.
Thank you. And some interesting comparisons to be drawn between your project, which at 10 years is the longest I think I've come across. So we can maybe talk about some of the challenges and benefits of that approach in the discussion section. I'd now like to pass over to Tanya Hamid, who will be presenting on the experiences of projects funded by the Life Chances Fund in the area of children's services. Over to you, Tanya.
Great, thank you so much, Cheryl. Hi everyone, my name is Tanya Hamid and I'm a Research and Policy Associate here at the Go Lab at the University of Oxford. And it's a pleasure to be here with you today and to be sharing some of our recently published research, co-authored with El Carter. And as El said, this will be around children's social care projects in the Life Chances Fund funded here in England. So just to give you an overview of what I'll be talking through, so I'll be starting with a bit of a background on what children's social care looks like in England, then be moving on to an overview of our research approach, and then finally sharing some of the findings and reflections from our research. Just to kick off with some background on what this space looks like in England. So on the central government level, there's two main departments that are responsible for this area. So you have the Department for Education, which sets policies and legal frameworks. And then you have the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government, who are responsible for providing some of the funding to local authorities. But this is a devolved area of policy. So what this means is that ultimately it's the local authorities who are the point of referral, and they're the ones who have the independence to really set their own protocols in accordance with national guidelines. So upon referral, these cases go to local authorities, and they're the ones who make the assessment and decide on the appropriate sort of action to take. And in the meantime, in the UK, you also see central and local governments experimenting, particularly with innovative cross-sector contracting, with social investment. And one of the tools that they've been using more recently are social impact bonds. As you know, these were pioneered in the UK back in 2010, so we're more than 10 years into this. And as of September 2021, we have 88 impact bonds in the UK. 21 of these are within the child and family welfare policy area. So that means more than $27 million committed in investment, an ambition to reach more than 11,000 service users, and we see 17 in implementation, with 4 having already been completed. And the sort of graph that you see here shows how this has developed over the last decade. So as you see, the first one sort of started off in 2012, and over the last few years, particularly with the launch of the Life Chances Fund projects, we've seen more of a spike in the number of projects coming through in this policy area. Ultimately, it is one of the main policy areas in which impact bonds have been launched in this country. In terms of our own research, we believe this is the most detailed comparative investigation of impact bonds within children's social care to date. It's based on a deep dive evaluation study done for UK government, where we focused on 7 children's social care projects, all of them funded by the Life Chances Fund, which is a top-up fund dedicated to paying for social outcomes, backed by UK government in England. And so we had 3 main questions. So firstly, we wanted to ask people what was their rationale for choosing this tool and applying it within this policy area. So why use a social impact bond in the first place? Secondly, what were their design considerations when they were doing this? So what were the cohorts, what was the cohort specification? How did they think about outcomes and about pricing these outcomes? And then finally, to what degree did we see standardization in these design choices? In terms of methods, this is all sort of qualitative methods, so using both primary and secondary sources. But at the very heart of it were insights from very detailed in-person research workshops where we worked very collaboratively with local government development teams. And so jointly, we mapped out the sort of development timelines, the development journeys, the theories of change for each of these projects, and also provided space for reflection. And then we combined this with very detailed documentary analysis as well as detailed project data analysis. As I mentioned, 7 projects were studied. 6 of these were able to launch. 1 of them withdrew from the process. We spoke to 39 participants across these different projects from very diverse departments, including commissioning, finance, legal, procurement, and children's services. This is just to give you an idea of where these research sites were, so sort of fairly spread out across England. And then before we go into findings, it would be good to just revisit some of the context and to really talk about the pressures on children's social care in England. So we see 2 main pressures at the moment or over the last decade. So firstly, we've seen demand pressures, where we've seen an increase in the number of children and young people who have been going into care. At the same time, we're also seeing a higher number of children going into expensive residential placements. Financial pressures, so particularly following the financial crisis, a decade of austerity, lots of cuts to local government spending, we see reduced budgets for funding existing children's social care services, and we also see constraints to initiating new preventative services. And so in all of this, local governments have been able to protect a lot of the expenditure dedicated to children's social care, but with rising demand and with potentially rising costs, especially around expensive residential placements, this has led to a lot of overspending on budgets for a bulk of the local authorities involved. So when we spoke to people about what were their reasons to use a social impact bond in the space, we heard two main sort of rationales or primary justifications. So firstly, people were keen to use this as an opportunity to improve outcomes for service users. So this included a range of things. So it could be improving the quality of existing services, it could be expanding them and filling service gaps, or indeed just offering much more customized wraparound services to service users. Secondly, they saw this as an opportunity to counter financial constraints, so to potentially bring in external upfront sources of funding, and then particularly to tap into the Life Chances Fund, which was seen to de-risk and also to incentivize some of the experimentation. We also had some secondary justifications, so these were more indirect reasons which also fed into some of the decision-making processes. So these could be a range of things, including increased collaboration with new partners, both internally and externally, opportunities to use more preventative approaches, the opportunity to be more innovative and to track impact in more meaningful and robust ways. For the second part of the research, we were also keen to capture what the development processes themselves look like. And as we know, these can often be quite messy and protracted. So we tried to frame this by using the Go Labs Impact Bond Lifecycle tool. So this is a tool which tries to lay out a rough sort of trajectory of the different, a rough chronology of the different steps that are involved in a typical impact bond. So starting from reviewing the initial options, to designing it, to mobilizing, launching, and then ongoing learning and adaptation. As this report really focuses on the pre-launch phase of projects, we only focus on the first 4 stages of the process: reviewing options, developing the business case, managing relationships, and designing the service. And this is just an illustration of what these stages look like for 4 of these projects. And what we see is that while on a graphic, it's very easy to say that there are sort of, sequential steps. In practice, that's not really how the world works. And so we see that a lot of these steps actually happen in parallel. It's often a very non-linear, iterative and distinct process for each of the projects. But one thing that really stands out is the sort of green bars that you would see here. So these are the sort of manage relationship stage. And so this includes a range of things from, initiating contact with various stakeholders, really building buy-in with them, then the procurement processes that are involved, negotiations, and final contracting. So a range of things are involved in this stage, and this seems to be really the dominant stage in a lot of these projects. And that's not a surprise, I suppose, given how collaborative some of these projects are and how intense some of the development process can look like and how closely people have to work to get things off the ground. For the last part of the research, we try to explore design considerations and how people thought through these as they designed these projects. So again, we try to frame these through the Go Labs Triangle tool, where we suggest that there's 3 main things that people should be considering as they try to design a robust outcomes contract. So firstly, trying to really tightly define their eligible cohort, so really having a very good understanding of eligibility criteria and referral mechanisms. Number 2, ensuring that there's good alignment between payable outcomes and policy objectives, also ensuring that there's adequate time to track these and make sure the effect is stuck. And then finally, looking at outcomes prices, where it would be good to take into consideration the dead weight, the attribution, and once again have a suitably long tracking period. So we try to apply this to our analysis for the 7 projects, and once again that we saw that no 2 projects look alike, but largely starting with cohorts, we saw a wide range of cohorts. So usually most projects would include both children and young people at risk of entering care, so people at the edge of care, as well as people who are already in care. We also saw variation in age ranges, ranging from 5 to 17, variation in cohort sizes, so ranging from 30 to more than 1,800. In terms of outcomes, again, we saw projects targeting several different types or buckets of outcomes. So this could be anything from prevention to engagement to stepping down. So stepping down children and young people from residential care to foster care, reunification with families or guardians, and sustainment of outcomes or placements. We also saw a range in the number of payment triggers that were indicated, so from 2 to 9 across different projects. And we saw that local authorities also varied in the level of specification they used for their interventions. So for some of them, it could be quite prescriptive, where they really wanted to use particular high-fidelity interventions. But for others, this was a lot more flexible and really left this up to service providers and investors to sort of decide what's best. Finally, in terms of price, again, we saw variation in payment frequencies. These were often designed to spread out payments, to sustain cash flows, while also allowing enough time to demonstrate impact. We also saw clear payment caps used in most cases. So overall, we saw a low degree of standardization in design choices across these 7 projects. So just to summarize the things I've talked through, so we found that the participants in the study were often guided by both demand and financial pressures that we have seen in England over the last decade. So this brought them, on the one hand, an opportunity to improve outcomes for service users, and on the other hand, an opportunity to counter financial constraints. But despite these diverse demand and financial pressures, the logic of care was really at the heart of these projects. And so providing a holistic wraparound service to service users and really helping improve their outcomes was really a priority. Overall, we also saw a low degree of standardization in design, and we saw very distinct development journeys. So what does this mean? So I think a lot of us can agree that social impact bonds still perhaps need a bit more evidence, and we are all sort of striving to build that collectively. But at the same time, we are seeing local governments and practitioners using these tools as pragmatic fixes. So whether that's the opportunity to be more preventative rather than curative, the opportunity to invest in more long-term outcomes and track these for longer periods of time, to involve new, diverse and collaborative partners, to be flexible in service delivery. And this is something we saw especially come through during COVID-19, and also enable diverse design choices to be employed. And so all of these practical insights are really helpful in shedding more light on the tool and helping understand it better while we sort of try and move beyond just theoretical debates. So going forward, of course, we need more data sharing and transparency, but all these insights remain really useful. So that's everything I want to share, and you can find our research, which is now published on gov.uk, on this link, and my colleagues can also drop the link in the chat. You'll see a lot more there, which we don't have the time for today, but there's a lot more on economic analysis, theories of change, procurement analysis that might also be of interest. Thank you very much, and looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Tanya. It's great to be guided through those research findings. I noticed that Thomas has posted an interesting question in the chat, which I would encourage our panelists to take a look at, but it's quite a substantive question thinking about moving from project level to systems change. So I'm just going to encourage people to begin to mull that question over as I pass over to the team from the Positive Families Partnership to Mila from Bridges Fund Management, who will kick us off.
Right. Thank you so much. And firstly, thank you to all of the colleagues for sharing such brilliant work and ideas, because I'm certainly finding it incredibly motivating to hear such inspiring ideas and examples of social innovation. So it's really fantastic to be learning so much this morning. On our end, we are delighted to be sharing our work with you. So Positive Families Partnership, which, well, clues in the name. It's a partnership between 10 boroughs across London, and it started with 5 boroughs initially, but it expanded to 10 boroughs across London. 3 absolutely brilliant delivery partners: Family Action, Family Psychology Mutual, and the Mental Health Trust in Southwest London. Families and young people we're working with, of course, and the local communities that we try to engage in various ways. So we're really excited to be, we're really excited to have worked on this partnership for the last 3.5 years in delivery and a lot longer in development and implementation. And we are now coming to an end of our operational period. So the main intervention delivery actually completed in June. And we do have the final stages, which will complete at the end of this calendar year. The tracking will continue until June 2023. But we are delighted to know and share already that we have helped 410 families, and thus far, in terms of success rates, what we're seeing is that 91% success rate of families staying together and children staying out of care is being achieved. So we are obviously very delighted about that. In terms of the work, our mission has been to support children, young people and their families to stay together. And we have done that through through delivery of family-based interventions, which are, in this case, functional family therapy and multisystemic therapy. And Raphael and Jonathan will talk about the details and the features and innovations which helped us achieve these results and which are hopefully relevant to all others who are working in this field and who are trying to tackle similar issues, learned from things which worked well and things which didn't work so well. They will specifically hone in on two different innovations during this session. We have shared a third one in the materials, but would be delighted to share more during the discussion, if helpful, and of course following as well. So over to the dream team of Jonathan and Raphael. So Jonathan, would you mind taking over, please?
Yeah, of course. Thanks, Mila. Morning, everyone. So yeah, as Mila explained, we have been delivering and providing multisystemic therapy and family functional therapy for 3 years in London. And the groups and the of families and young people that we have been supporting, I think strikes quite a lot with colleagues from Finland and Sweden. The families have got complex family histories and current circumstances linked to risky behaviours, and all are at a place where there's a very strong risk and a growing risk of entering the care system. So here we've outlined one anonymised family where there was childhood trauma, witness of domestic violence. Mum was a single parent and struggling to cope, and the young person was extremely aggressive, which was a very common set of circumstances that we worked with. So our focus and our work really across the 10 boroughs that we worked with, and again striking a parallel with certainly the RISE project, where integration with the 10 boroughs that we're working with was really important, and offering these two interventions with the backing of the local authorities and being a local solution, so we could reach as many families as we possibly could. Our work focused on building and improving a relationship between the family members, so the parent or parents could help the young person and help control their behaviour, and so young people and parents could help each other. Often the parents in these situations had gone through very difficult circumstances as well, and really building and improving that family bond, which I know Raphael will talk about a little bit later on, was really, really vital in both the MST and FFT work that we did. So we, in delivery, there were quite a few things that made us, I think, different from other deliveries of these of MST and FFT, and I'll just go through a few of them quickly, and Raf and I are going to focus on two in detail going forward. And as Mila said, we grew from 5 boroughs originally to 10 boroughs, which was so the scalability of the project was something that was quite different from us. The choice of interventions, providing MST and FFT alongside each other was really important. There's slight differences between the therapies, and providing that choice to families and also to the social care systems within the 10 boroughs was hugely helpful. The voice of the family, Raphael's going to speak a lot about that, about the voice and the information that we're able to feed back to families. Raf and I are both going to talk about the post-therapy support that we did, and that was really due and thanks to the long tracking periods that we were able to. That was a characteristic of the overall project. This is what Mila was talking about at the point that we maybe won't be able to touch on in a lot of detail, but just to say we tweaked some of the setup of the teams, the FFT team, to match what we were doing in London. Remote delivery with COVID, we were very quick to move online and also apply funding to make sure there wasn't, for IT solutions, to make sure there wasn't any inequality in access to the services. And then these last two, the teams, because we're embedded within the local authorities, similar to what the RISE team was saying earlier, we were able to integrate and to collaborate within the local authorities, pan London and in the boroughs themselves to provide what was the best possible service for the families. And then just simply that we were offering sort of an asset and strength based service to the families to really support them in the best way we could. I'll skip over that because that's just the structure of what we're going to be talking about going forward. So Raphael, if it's okay, I'll hand over to you to talk about the voice of the family.
Yeah, and how lovely to be described as part of a dream team. I absolutely adore it. That's made my morning. So for me, as a qualified family therapist, social worker and supervisor of the functional family therapy team in the PFP project, one of the key and valuable aspects of the project has been the clinical use of questionnaires, which we would do before therapy and at the end of therapy. And by clinical use of questionnaires, I mean sort of using questionnaires not only for data monitoring purposes to analyse pre-post treatment outcomes, but also as a tool to be used with families to enhance our work. And there are several aspects in this sort of clinical use of questionnaires. First, the questionnaires have so-called critical items that, if marked, may indicate severe mental health challenges or safeguarding or abuse concerns, allowing us to follow up with the statutory social worker to provide robust risk management and planning for the family. Second, questionnaires allow us to identify severity of need if a particular result reaches what they call a clinical cutoff. And third, what families say on those forms and questionnaires often provide some really important themes that inform our clinical interventions for MST and FFT. So my prior experience as a social worker and family therapist is that mandating questionnaires often ends up becoming a tick box exercise rather than a means of sort of enhancing or sharpening clinical practice. But I feel that this project allowed us to develop a very different conceptualization of the use of questionnaires, which in turn really drove clinical practice. And remarkably, what we found on the ground was that very often families had never been asked questions about key mental health or family issues such as self-harming or suicidality. And we found that many needs weren't actually being met by existing services. Something about the questionnaire, having it on a form rather than being asked face-to-face, seemed to allow for a greater openness, not always possible with the regular sort of face-to-face questioning, really. So perhaps if we move to the next slide, just to provide a bit of an illustration of what this looked like. Here we go, lovely smooth transition. So we have here an example of data that therapists would be using to monitor outcomes for a particular family. And in this case, it's a young person's outcomes pre and post therapy. In most cases, we would be feeding this back to a family and assist with onward referrals after completion of therapy. If we've identified any sort of outstanding areas of need after we finish treatment. In this case, for the young people, we would do a strength and difficulties questionnaire, which would assess conduct, emotional and behavioural difficulties of a young person. The core 10, you can see there sort of more in the middle, is a measure of psychological distress, and score 15 is an overview of family functioning. Questionnaires are, of course, open to interpretation. You can see here, fantastic, all positive little green ticks, which we would feed back to the family and in a sense boosted their sense of experience of the therapy as well. You know, this is a positive experience. Sometimes individual cases, I wouldn't say very, very often, but you would sometimes see worsening results. Say for a young person, you sort of wonder what that's about. I have to say, we often found that, particularly for young people, it doesn't happen extremely often, but when we found scores seeming not to be as great at the end of therapy, it's often because the young person at the beginning were extremely minimizing of the impact of their behaviors on their lives and their family lives. So if they had statutory social work involvement on a child protection plan, often there might be more secrecy or concealment within a family. And the therapy might have allowed greater openness and bonding within families to be more honest and open about their challenges and difficulties. So always in a case-by-case situation, we would open up the discussion with families, and it became in its own right a very powerful intervention to share pre and post outcomes with families. We move on to the next slide. Another smooth transition. Don't want to say too much about this, but just to remote, this is the score 15, which is a measure of family functioning, but just to note really how remarkable the impact is of our interventions on family functioning in general. So we hear sort of 39% reduction of parents reporting a clinical level of concern in their family communication and structure, and a 29% decrease of young people reporting clinical level of concern in their family. That's really remarkable. Most services also don't get that level of pre and post questionnaire completion, but because we made it such a tool of such clinical importance, I think it motivated and mobilized therapists to see the importance of it, which in turn rubbed off on families. Families then became very keen to complete these questionnaires. I think then we're moving on to think about the post-therapy support. Shall I move over to you, Jonathan, for this part?
Yeah, thanks, Raphael. Yeah, so in this section, we're going to talk about the tracking period and the information we're able to gather, and an example of how we tweaked some of our service delivery based on that data. So as the previous presentation said, the length of the tracking period for us was a really positive aspect of the contract. The 2 years post the completion of MST-FFT, tracking the young person's care status. And what that allowed us to do was look at when challenges or when issues were potentially popping up through those 2 years. And one of the things that we noticed in the data was that FFT, the team that Raphael was leading, offered some booster sessions for families who'd regressed, and there was a renewed risk of the young person going into care. And we looked at the data for that, and we looked at the status of the young person after those booster sessions. And we found that the family staying together for those who had booster sessions, who'd reached out for help and had some top-up support, was nearly 9% higher than our success rate as an entire project at the time, which was a really interesting result, especially as these families were at a point where care was on the was a distinct possibility again. And Raphael, I'll hand back to you maybe just to talk a little bit about maybe what we did with that data, and then the ongoing work that we're still doing post-project.
Yes, the data was very powerful in allowing us to provide a sort of extension of a booster extension of the project for 6 months, involving very proactive follow-up with families who completed therapy. Should say that FFT functional family therapy does allow for boosters as part of the clinical model, and the goals are sort of extending positive family functioning to new situations or systems, planning for relapse prevention, and sort of incorporating community systems like probation or schools or rest of it really into the treatment process. But we really tailored and accommodated that booster provision in consultation with FFT LLC of the States, and transformed it into a formal follow-up process that is for therapists, it's a therapist and a supervisor to be extremely proactive in reaching out to families, ensure they're still on track, offer consolidation and guidance, and then also offer formal booster sessions. I think we found that this proactive follow-up was important and not actually necessary for the model. So this is a bit how we accommodated it. That proactive follow-up is so important because we found that there was so much turnover of social workers and senior management in local authorities that knowledge of FFT boosters was easily lost. And secondly, in our experience, families may feel a bit of reluctance to reach out themselves for support. when they're experiencing a relapse or a renewed risk of entry into care for the young person, and often due to feelings of shame or failure. So us actually reaching out broke through some of those barriers, and we're still in the midst of this, really. We've got another few months to go, but I think just highlights a sort of level of innovation we were able to bring to a manualized license model. Yeah, and I think the other aspect of this to really hammer home, and I think again it's a little bit of our accommodation, is the significant impact of using boosters for supporting reunification. So once we developed close working relationships with social workers and families, is that if a young person temporarily went into care, and quite recently, we could support the allocated social worker design a robust and realistic and workable reunification plan. And the therapy could be slotted in as booster sessions to facilitate that. So I think that increase in reduced episodes of care, I think, is often linked to those reunification cases where we've supported the social worker and the family with the young person coming back home. Yeah, so really, really positive.
I think we'll probably leave it there. We do have, as I said, a couple more slides on another example, but we're very happy to chat to colleagues about that later. So yeah, thank you, and looking forward to further discussions.
Fantastic. Jonathan, Raphael, Mila, thank you so much for sharing that really powerful case with us. It's now time to move into the discussion portion of our session today. So please do write any questions you have into the chat on the Zoom channel. But to kick us off, I was wondering, Thomas, you posed a question for the other panelists. Could I come to you to ask this question?
Yes. So as we maybe hurried through our presentation a bit, I just want to emphasize that one implication, as we see it, in order to make this change or to evolve our thinking around social outcomes contracting, that raises the demands on us as an organization, and indeed on all our partners as well that we are collaborating with. So, but it's not entirely clear for us what kind of competencies and the practices that we need to implement in order to actually achieve this change. And I know there are several people working on similar projects around the world, and in the UK not least. So I'm just interested to hear what you're thinking on this. And I mean, to make this move from designing a business case and setting up outcomes metrics, which is still a very important issue, of course, and something that we're also very engaged in. But then we have to add on many other competencies as well, and capacities as to make this implementation strategy more holistic. So I'm just interested to hear what your thoughts on that.
Thanks, Thomas. Mila's reaching for a mic.
I mean, I'm happy to start, but happy not to as well. Yeah, no, I think that's a. Oh, there it is. Perfect. It's a bit overwhelming to be kind of live with people around you. I think what I was most struck by in your discussions is the thinking around local solutions, and I think that certainly is what we are experiencing, and I mean it's I suppose it's not new at all, and it is just thinking about how to find ways of creating an ecosystem and creating most likely situations where such work can be implemented. And I think that in terms of implementation, I think that has been, from our perspective, the most important part of delivery, I suppose, and part where social innovation can really get created. And I think finding ways to create such partnerships and sustain such partnerships is really hard. And exactly as you said, it requires a lot of effort and commitment, and the environment which is really facilitating that. But I think that is precisely what Jonathan and the team have spent a lot of time figuring out in terms of figuring out how to work in partnership with the local authorities and how to continue evolving practices to respond to some of the challenges, like some of the existing systems or teams leaving and teams changing and so on. So I guess it's not an answer to your question in terms of what's needed, but I think it is certainly an acknowledgement that from our experience feels incredibly important, and finding ways to really invest in local partnerships and support ecosystems and teams to create that long-term relationships is absolutely necessary to create socially innovative local solutions.
Thank you. I thought that, Tanya, when you presented your findings, you highlighted that that the designs have been very unique for each case and so on, and I guess that could be in line with this discussion, or do you see that as something that we should try to avoid, having these very bespoke solutions, or how are you thinking on that?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much for the question. I guess a couple of different things. So in some ways, I think that's a real advantage, that local authorities feel like they can sort of prioritize their own demand pressures, their own priorities, and put those forward, and have a range of design choices that they can sort of use to build the project that works best for them and their local sort of service users. So I wouldn't say that's a bad thing. But I think what we did here when we were speaking to people was more a call for sharing information, sharing data. And that's something, as you know, we always sort of try and advocate for. So whether that's sharing more templates, sharing more information, how these things are designed, priced, or even defined, because some of it was around the lack of standardization of definitions within this policy area. So how you define even something like what is edge of care, what is being at risk, some very subjective terms. So being clear on what those mean. And then beyond that, an added level of complications, of course, the impact bond structure on top, which in our case, all of these projects we're doing for the first time. So we're really sort of looking for other people who had done them, and speaking to them was useful for them. So in a lot of cases, we heard that they'd spoken to other local authorities who had prior experience of using this in children's social care, and were able to learn and, in fact, often emulate some of their thinking and design. But then we also saw another good example of trying to build ecosystems, which Mila also touched upon. So particularly in the Pyramid Project, which is based in Staffordshire. I'm not sure if we have someone from there today in our audience, but they have done a really good job of trying to build a great therapeutic foster care system in the area and supporting that going forward. So maybe if someone is joining us from there, they can speak a bit more about it. But generally, I think all of those things together, building the ecosystem, sharing more information, sharing more data, can be helpful both on the development side, but hopefully also when you get to implementation in terms of learning from challenges and best practices, and being more open to sharing that learning.
Great. And actually, that's also one of our thoughts, that transparency is a very important component that we need to learn. And it's quite hard for everyone, I think, to be, it's at least in our Swedish context, the local authorities are not really used to sharing their mistakes and being very honest with them. And I guess the same goes for most service providers and maybe research institutes and so on. So I think that's definitely a part of this.
Thanks, Thomas. That support to learn is always an important thing to emphasise. We've got some great questions coming in on the chat. Please do keep them coming. You could also raise your hand if there's a particular point that you would like to come in and talk about, if you're a member of our online audience. I noticed that Elaine had quite a specific question around the mental health questionnaires that were used. So, Raphael, that might be a more particular one for you to pick up. And there's also been a question come in from Kath around referral challenges and how this gets conveyed to staff. Would anyone want to pick up on this challenge from Kath around ensuring that projects work with the young people for whom they're really intended?
I can say a little bit about that from PFP if that would be helpful.
Please do, Jonathan.
Yeah, so well, with MST and FFT, because of evidence-based therapies, we had the risk factors associated with the successful delivery of those interventions. So we had a sort of criteria, and we were able to work with the local authorities in quite a collaborative way to make sure we were hitting people or bringing people onto the program who it was going to be the best option for. I would just say, I think sometimes it was almost the forum that was and the process, or the pathway that those referrals could come to us that was almost more important than the actual criterias. And it's something that I found quite interesting with Thomas and colleagues with the RISE project. We found working with the 10 boroughs where we had a forum for a very open forum for clinicians to discuss and understand what a family's particular case, and look at all of the options within the local authority, both internal and commission services. We found that was the where we had the best use of MST and FFT, and I think that the best kind of feedback in terms of sort of integration of not only us but sort of other services within the local authority. So yeah, really just to say that the criteria and the risk factors is one thing, but the forums and the pathways was almost more important within PFP.
Thanks, Jonathan.
I can continue there because we worked almost the same way. As I said, this project has been operative for only a couple of weeks, but it has been in development for almost 2 years now. And a lot of work has been done investigating what are the actual target group. And in that process, the social services have been really, really involved just to make sure that we, as you said, Jonathan, hit the right target group where our help is most needed. So the social services have been involved in this work for, 1.5 years at least. So they are very prepared for a referral to this council. So that's actually been going quite well. And as for you guys, we're also looking into risk factors, and that's what we base the referrals on. So that's what is basically presented at this council where we discuss suitable interventions.
Thanks, Louisa. Really interesting to hear these similar approaches in terms of the dialogue that needs to happen around ensuring that these services are communicating appropriately with social services in the right way to understand that the way to work together most effectively. I understand that Laura from Social Finance NL has a question. So Laura, would you like to ask that live?
Yeah, yes, it would be my pleasure. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to the merits and the challenges of running these type of programs through social outcomes contracts. So a little bit looking more at the infrastructure through which they're financed and whether the financiers are involved in development of the interventions, and maybe also speak a little bit to how that might help or inhibit the scale up of or potential scale up of these projects.
I suppose that's kind of directed to me, so I have to. So in terms of the, whether it's an outcomes contract or not, I think that there are many different ways in which family therapy services are implemented, of course, and in many cases they work very well and differently depending on the context. I think in this case, the reason why the pooling of boroughs was really important was because that created that pooled resource that Jonathan talked about, and which actually enabled London boroughs, which are generally smaller and not able to support a full team of this kind of family therapy intervention. It enabled all of them to have access to this type of work. Now, that probably could have been done through a different contracting arrangement as well, because it's the pooling that was important, but there was an aspect of ease in the sense that if organizations are pooled around an outcome rather than kind of trying to split a service and trying to split the funding based on not exactly knowing how many families one will work with, that probably would have been a bit harder to define up front. So there is an aspect of, if you are trying to create broader reach and broader partnership, like in Pyramid actually, where a number of different local authorities are coming together to access the same service, corralling everybody around the same outcomes rather than activities can be beneficial. So that's point number one. And that did definitely make it easier to expand access. So the actual infrastructure was built in a way whereby the Greater London Authority helped, together with Social Finance, actually UK, helped create that infrastructure where any London borough could then participate in the contract, and the contracts were set up in a way whereby that was easy to do and easy to implement. And that, again, well, at the time of the implementation, it was kind of the fastest expansion, if you will, from what initially was 5 outcomes contracts to 10. In terms of the involvement of social investments, the development was, as I said, done by Social Finance UK together with Greater London Authority and the number of active design partners, predominantly the 5 local or the 5 boroughs, the founding 5 boroughs. And it was that partnership which kind of defined the vision of what it is that they want to put to the market. And really, the market only started being involved at the point of procurement. Now, there were market engagement events, but we would probably say that for these complex partnerships where the partnership is so important in implementation, probably a bit more collaborative design up front would have been helpful amongst everybody, not necessarily, not just from the implementing organizations, but everybody kind of coming together to think through how the partnership will work in practice. But then going forward, the delivery was very much done through through Positive Families Partnership and, of course, the delivery partners that we identified or that we talked about.
And I can add to that, I think. So when we spoke to local authorities, I think some of the things that they cited as potential advantages of using the impact bond model and the sort of funding that's associated with it came through. So firstly, the opportunity to sort of use more long-term funding and to focus more on preventative approaches, the potential to have more cash flow savings going forward, particularly given this area and the implications it has in terms of long-term outcomes for people, whether that's in employment or social outcomes or education. But also in particular the flexibility that the outcomes orientation brings. And that's something that I think came through quite strongly in COVID-19. So being able to adapt to more hybrid approaches, because ultimately it's the outcome that was being paid for, and the activities themselves or the format in which they were delivered was not very prescriptive. So without that sort of flexibility, that might not have been possible. So that was something that really came through, but also the flexibility in design. So on to Thomas's question before, the fact that even though they were receiving funding from the central government outcomes fund, there was no prescription around these are the exact outcomes you must have, or this is the exact rate card or price setting that you must follow. So being given that flexibility to design something that works for you, I think worked well. But I think most of all, something that came through was the collaborative approach that a lot of people spoke about. So being able to work with lots of new internal and external stakeholders, but also working with them much closer than they would have otherwise, and being able to engage feedback and reflection from others at a very early stage, which usually would have happened much later in their opinion. So some of those things people said they would like to continue onwards and in other projects as well. So there seem to be some clear emerging, advantages, but it's too early to say because all these are in implementation at the moment.
Thanks, everyone, for those shared reflections. I wanted to bring Esko-Pekka into the conversation here. And there was a question that came in, I think, from Irina around returns and expected returns. But I wanted to bring this together with the duration of your project, Esko-Pekka. I think I'm right. Is it 10 years long? How do you go about bringing partners together for this duration? And do you have any reflections on what that means in terms of the type of investors and the returns that they're thinking of here?
Mm. Well, of course, there has been made contracts for 10 years, so everyone is entitled to the project for that time period. And well, I think it's quite important that the project is such a long, because what Thomas mentioned in the beginning, that the short-sightedness in when concerning welfare innovations. I think based on my experience as a social worker, whenever there's a question about money in public sector, there's this preventative approach is often replaced with very quick interventions that are expensive at the moment, with low impact on the long run. So in this project, when we think about a young person, for example, age 15, and if she or he doesn't want to participate at that moment, there's a good chance that maybe when she or he is a bit older, she or he can still participate in this project and get the benefits in the later age. And I think it's quite important that there is the study, longitudinal study made by the Finnish Health and Welfare Institute, that probably we will get good data for the benefits of this project for maybe later on for some welfare innovations in Finland.
Thank you very much. Really interesting to hear that we've got this ability for young people to sort of drop in and drop out, but for the service to always be there for them. Thank you for sharing that insight. I actually wonder whether anyone on the Positive Families Partnership team has any reflections on the duration of these contracts and the way in which families are supported over a longer term timeline than maybe other services. Is that maybe a question for Raphael and Jonathan?
Ralph, do you want to? Should I start? Do you want to come in? Yeah. So I mean, so our intervention was 3 to 5 months, and I think particularly with MST and FFT, there is a sort of a distinct time frame with that, and stages that a family will go through in the intervention, aimed at addressing problems, building relationships, and then generalizing to other situations that may be a trigger for problems within the family and difficult behavior. So and that's very much in the sort of the evidence base of the models, and is shown to create a change. So there is a sort of a fairly long duration there, and I think again, so I'm going back to a previous point, but the collaboration then with the local authorities, and some of the stuff that Raphael spoke about with the clinical questionnaires, provides a bit of ongoing, information, and B, the forum and the connection with the local authorities to think about how the families are supported on an ongoing basis. So we don't sort of say that we've made all the difference, because it's never the case. I mean, a family will always need, or very likely will need, some ongoing support in a different forum, and hopefully a less intensive forum as they go forward from MST and FFT. And I think we didn't touch on it in the presentation, but it's reflected in the reducing. So in the UK we have I forgot how you describe it, Raphael. You have CP and SIN and child in need social care statuses of rising sort of complexity, and we see post MST and FFT a reduction in the severity of those statuses, which is something that we reflect on almost as much as the in care out of care sort of percentages. Mila, Raf, I don't know if you want to come in on that at all.
Just a really minor point, because I think Chair wants to move the discussion on, but if I may, Chair. I think that the long-term relationship is really, really important, and that is incredibly important in terms of embedding and establishing all of the collaboration and partnerships that you talked about, and actually trying to do that over a 3.5 year implementation period was actually quite hard, because 3.5 years is actually quite a short time. And although there was quite a long, well, not quite a long, although there was a mobilization period, it's still hard to embed all of that within embed and build those relationships over such a period. Now there is a 2-year tracking period, and although on one hand we love that because it does, create long-term data, and it does enable us to come up with conclusions like we did with booster sessions, which also there were interesting other findings around similar activities. I think it is the reality, and maybe we don't have time now, but the reality that we've experienced in terms of how local authorities deal with that is that it is challenging for them from the budgetary perspective to be managing something with such a long run-off period. So I think there is a question of how to build something, how to create a structure whereby you have the long-term relationships, you have the collaboration that we all shared is incredibly needed and powerful, but at the same time it's building within potentially restraints and constraints within the budgetary structures of how both local and central governments operate.
Thank you very much. Oh, sorry, Raf, go ahead.
I'm going to say something so inconsequential now. I feel like I shouldn't have. But I also feel that the boroughs will want different things. I mean, although it's the same board cohort, I don't know if this is experience of other SIBs in other contexts, but there's slightly different expectations. And what's sad in a way is it's hard work, I think, building relationships. I think that it is a lot of work, a lot of efforts. And we're short, if it's only a 3-year contract, you feel like you've just got there after 2.5 years, you've made a lovely, smooth referral route, the relationships are really good, and then you're ending. I find that as a clinician, like really challenging, and I can see some nods there, but I think that relationship building is so important, but such hard work and requires so much focus and energy. But then often once you've got there, the time's up or approaching the end. Yeah, that's my inconsequential remark. So I'm gonna mute myself now. That's great.
Oh, thank you for that. Thank you. I wanted to draw us back to this theme around a more multifaceted understanding of the challenges that are being faced by some of these families. And I was really struck by some of the concepts that the RISE team described around this more collaborative council of different social sector organisations who are involved in delivery. And this question of a backbone. And I think this is an interesting theme that you were beginning to hit on, Raphael, around structures for relationships. And so I wondered whether anyone from the RISE team would elaborate a little bit on what this structure looks like. What is this collaborative council that we have here?
Okay, I can start, and then Thomas can fill in my gaps. It's actually a really good question. So far in the projects that Jacob presented, it actually consists of a network of actors that collaborate on different levels. So it's not that that concrete, but what is concrete is that the definition of where they work in Husby, which is a really small part of Stockholm, and they also collaborate from a specific house, a specific meeting place. And then we have, as a backbone organization, what we do is we facilitate these conversations that they have. So together with the whole group, all the actors, which is local authorities, civil society actors, so far no one from the private sector, but we hope that they will contribute as well. Together with them and together with the citizens, we define which problems to face, what we think is the best interventions to face those problems, and how we should evaluate these projects, and also how we should evaluate the actual collaboration format itself. So there's a lot of things going on all different levels. So I'm a bit short of time and don't really know how to put that in a concise way.
Just add one point to that, Lovisa, if I may share, and that corresponds with Raphael's comments as well. Is we see our contribution to that table is to build their own capacity. I think we make it sit hard for ourselves if we try to find a solution and try to give an organization or a collaborative structure solution. We try to build the capacity for the model itself and for the collaboration to be sustained over time. So we really want to make that clear in the beginning of that kind of collaboration structure, that we are here to support the implementation and support the planning and evaluation, but this is your thing here. So I think that corresponds to Raphael's comment as well, to build those relationships over time, but that they are independent once they go further than that.
Thank you. It's also really helpful to think about that evolution of relationships within this collaborative arrangement. Thank you. Mila, I wonder if I could pass to you just to try and bring some of these themes together in terms of structures for collaboration, and if you have any reflections for what next for your project.
Absolutely, I'm delighted to, and thank you for that. I think that it's just incredibly exciting to hear so many similar themes, but from within different contexts and coming from different angles. So I think it is really important that we share our learning and continue moving forward everything that we're doing. I think in terms of structure for collaboration, I think one example, which probably many of you are familiar with, but one example to share, which in my opinion is really powerful, is West London Zone. So when we talk about, so that is an organization, a charity here in the UK, which has found a way to really embed itself with the local community and find ways of creating long-term approaches within schools and in partnership with local authorities, in partnership with local organizations and so on. So I think that is an interesting example, which definitely has a lot of features that are relevant to many of the points that we discussed. But what's next? I think it's up to us to continue learning and finding ways of creating structures which address many of the points that Elaine listed. And I think what I personally find really motivating is that both on the local authority and central government side, there is a shift. And for example, yes, the spending review was just announced this week, but there is also movement towards creating budgets and creating spending reviews and creating structures which focus on long-term outcomes and not just in-year funding. And I think that from the infrastructure side, if we think about that financial and contractual thing as infrastructure for this type of delivery, I think that is really important, and I find that incredibly motivating. On the delivery and practitioner side, I think it is about continuing to advance the practices that we all talked about. So recognizing the importance of that collaborative design when developing services, and recognizing that in many cases that's the bit which suffers because people, you want to launch something quickly and you need to, in many cases you do need to do it quickly, and then it's thinking about how to build flexibility in delivery so that you can reflect that collaboration and learning along the way, and then just finding ways to be really truly accountable to all of the people you're working with, both in terms of teams and individuals who we're trying to help.
Thanks. Thanks, Mila, for bringing some of those threads together, and a thread that Michael also picks up on in the discussion in terms of this exchange and the need to bring different stakeholders, different actors together to really work so much more collaboratively around these projects. I think what's interesting is that historically, I think social impact bonds have had a very technical description and a very techie fix type language around them, but actually what we've been talking about today has been structures for collaboration, structures to bring different partners together on a long-term relationship that's purposeful to try and improve outcomes for children and young people. So it's been great to share those insights and reflections from a diverse set of projects across Europe. I'd like to thank all of our panelists once again for joining us. It has been fantastic to have you all. Thank you for joining us. Audience members, thank you for chipping in with your comments and reflections in the chat. Thanks for tuning in. What's next is a coffee break for those who are with us in person in Oxford. And if you're online and would like a chance to have a bit of a debrief with some of your fellow audience members, we are able to have an informal chat online, and we can put you into breakout rooms for discussions. So stay online if you would like to have a bit of a chat. But thank you once again for joining us, everyone. See you all again soon. Thank you.